You know the stories. You've heard them your whole life. Man landed on the moon. We are truly an amazing species. But this is not that story. This is the story of what really happened to those men who flew to the moon 52 years ago, how their lives changed forever, what they went through no human had ever gone through before, and how even now, half a century later, they still pay a heavy price for having seen the face of the moon up close. I think most people know what happened on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. He took one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. Buzz Aldrin joined him, and together they spent around 2 hours outside the lunar module, taking samples, planting an American flag, and taking pictures, while Michael Collins stayed in lunar orbit aboard the command module. But there are many things that we don't know. For example, did Neil Armstrong really say, "That's one small step for man"? No. The transcript of the original broadcast from NASA shows that he said, "That's one small step for a man," a simple change of a word that seems to have been lost over time. But there are bigger mysteries than the correct reading of an astronaut's words. We tend to remember that this was a huge political statement, the height of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union. But we forget that it was also a dangerous mission with plenty of opportunities for things to go wrong and for those 3 astronauts to die. I mean, let's look at the Saturn V rocket they were aboard. It stood 363 feet tall, which is about as tall as a 37-story building, weighed around 2.5 million pounds, and was capable of carrying almost 14 tons into low Earth orbit. The moon landings saw the Saturn V used just 4 times. 2 of those launches failed before they reached orbit. 1 more failed during its journey to the moon, and the only successful one was Apollo 11, the mission that landed Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. It was literally a case of 3rd time's a charm, but if either of the previous launches had succeeded, we would likely be telling a very different story today. Those astronauts would be dead. And it wasn't just the launch that was fraught with danger. The crew of Apollo 11 made it to the moon after a 3-day flight. They then had to land it, a process that nearly went wrong when the guidance system malfunctioned. Had that happened, the ship would have crashed into the moon and killed everyone inside. And even when they touched down, there were another dozen ways in which they could have died. Their spacesuits had electrical issues. There were multiple points where a micrometeorite could have struck a vital part of their suit or their ship and killed them instantly. Not to mention the fact that they were exploring a completely alien environment with temperatures swinging from 250 degrees Fahrenheit to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. If anything had gone wrong with their suits, they would have frozen, suffocated, or exploded in a horrifying combination of the 3. And yet somehow everything went right, and Armstrong and Aldrin came back safely to Earth along with Collins. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii and were welcomed home by millions of people around the world. Their achievement was huge, historic, inspiring. It changed the course of science and exploration. These 3 men were heroes. But now let's talk about what happened next. First of all, they became very famous. Neil Armstrong probably expected to become quite famous, but I don't think any of them were prepared for the worldwide adulation that they received. Over the following weeks and months, they traveled to Europe to meet with royalty. They appeared on TV shows. They toured the country meeting politicians and celebrities. They were invited to every major talk show. They met with the president, and they were interviewed in hundreds of magazines and newspapers. Their lives were turned upside down, and not necessarily in a good way. For Neil Armstrong, the fame and attention meant that he started to struggle in his role as NASA astronaut. He was supposed to fly Apollo 18, but that was canceled, and he was offered Apollo 19. He turned it down. He retired from NASA in August of 1970 and spent much of his remaining career teaching at the University of Cincinnati. For Buzz Aldrin, he managed to avoid some of the worst of the publicity, and he even got to fly again, piloting an aircraft carrier during the Vietnam War. But once that was over, he also retired from NASA. He has since become a speaker and an advocate for space travel. But he, too, was done being a public figure after leaving the space program. Michael Collins didn't have it quite as bad as the other two, but he still struggled with the attention. He was a reluctant hero, unsure of what to do next. He wrote a book and eventually became an ambassador for NASA. But like the other two, he stepped away from the spotlight as soon as he possibly could. But it wasn't just the unwanted fame that they had to deal with. They all left the space program relatively young and without the pension that most government employees receive. This meant that they had to find new careers, but they couldn't use most of the skills that they had developed during their astronaut training. To make matters worse, NASA tried to stop them from revealing any details about their time at the agency. So they couldn't even leverage their unique experience to make themselves stand out. This led to resentment and anger, especially from Collins, who felt like he'd been treated unfairly. In 1970, he wrote, "I believe my services were terminated because my value to NASA was at an end and my salary was regarded as a useless expense. I was expendable. My departure would cause minimum reaction and would leave the door open for someone younger and cheaper. But perhaps the biggest cost was the personal toll that the missions took on them. All three men were forever changed by what they experienced. All three suffered from anxiety and depression, though Collins seemed to suffer the worst. He often felt isolated and alienated from his friends and family. He even admitted to having panic attacks and struggling to sleep. In his book, Carrying the Fire, he wrote, "You can call it space madness if you want to, but I prefer to think of it as a natural reaction to an unnatural situation. The thing I feared most has happened. I'm crazy. What else is new? The rest of the world is crazy too. Aren't they the ones who sent me into outer space?" Neil Armstrong was haunted by the fact that he was chosen over so many other astronauts to be the first person to walk on the moon. He grappled with the idea that he was a lucky guy who stumbled onto something incredible by chance. He knew that he didn't deserve it more than any of his fellow astronauts, and that knowledge tormented him. It wasn't until decades later that the truth finally emerged. The reason that Armstrong was chosen for the historic mission had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a secret NASA project called the Gemini 11 Gang Green. As part of this program, Armstrong and Collins trained for an emergency procedure that would allow them to switch ships in orbit. At the time, it was top secret. But years later, it was revealed that it had been a crucial test for Apollo 11. This was why Armstrong was selected for the mission. He had been trained to take over in an emergency, which ended up happening when the guidance system failed. And if he hadn't been trained for that scenario, they would likely have all died. So while these men will forever be remembered as the first humans to set foot on the moon, they know the truth. They know that their achievement was a matter of being in the right place at the right time. They know that they might have been better prepared than the others, but that's because of a secret project that they weren't supposed to be involved in. And they know that it might have had nothing to do with their skill. So was it worth it? Was it worth sacrificing their mental health, their careers, and their futures for a moment in history that they didn't even ask for? Well, here's what each of them had to say. Michael Collins said, "If I had to do it again, I would. I wouldn't trade. But I think it was an awfully high price to pay. I have never been able to recapture that freedom. I have been through periods of deep depression. I have been through periods of not wanting to see another sunrise. I can't tell you how many cocktail napkins I've signed saying, 'To the one who stayed up in the spacecraft hoping that the other two wouldn't die so he could come home.' That's real. I was very, very lonely." Buzz Aldrin said, "Yes, it's wonderful to have been part of that, and a very proud part, but I think it was certainly worth it, yes. Did I know that I would feel sort of displaced forever? No, I didn't know that. But I think I do now. I don't know that I would trade it. I think it was worth it." And Neil Armstrong said, "My own view is that man was not put on this earth to be a spectator. Man has the capability of doing some really special things, but unless he has the courage to attempt things, he'll never know what he can do. My view is that we ought to go ahead and explore and push on ahead. We don't have anything to lose. Now watch." They really went to the moon. Evidence NASA doesn't want you to know or check out. Why does NASA keep lying about aliens?